I'm Velda, and sorry for all the technical difficulties, but I'm going to have to actually kind of look over here too because I don't have it on the screen. Anyway, this is what your designer didn't tell you. This whole slide design is purposely kind of undesigned, and you guys will kind of run into that quite a bit. We have some misconceptions about what design is and is not. Actually, first I'll go ahead and introduce myself a little bit. I'm a designer. I'm a mom. I'm a bit of a geek. I did web hosting for several years, and before that I did support and help desk and SQL stuff and all kinds of random stuff. But through the years, I've kind of moved more and more toward design. I don't know why, but it's what I ended up doing. So I kind of have some understanding of what you guys are going through. I assume, how many people here are developers, actually? And how many develop for open source projects ever? Okay, so, or how many use open source projects and like submit patches and things like that? Most of you, what I have noticed in most of the open source projects that I've run into is that you have developers, maybe not a lot of developers depending on the size of the project, but you typically don't have very many designers who are involved in the community. And so this presentation is kind of to help you know what to do when you don't have a designer, and just try to get moving along and keep things kind of looking decent before you get a designer on board. So, and we can have questions as we go. I like that, or we also can have questions and answers at the end. So, okay. We have misconceptions with what design is and is not, especially among developers. I find that a lot of times people assume that design is art, and it's not. I love art. I have always loved art, but design is not this, okay? There's a problem with this. It's great for what it does. It's great for art, but if you look at that, what does that mean? This is like probably one of the best known pieces of art in the world. But what does that mean? People always talk about the Mona Lisa and how you can't even quite tell what she's thinking about or what's going on, and you sit there and ponder it. You don't want people to come to your page and have to sit there and ponder what's going on, right? That would be a bad thing. So, and then there's that. This is another really great. I don't know if you guys have seen this before. I see this picture and I just go, wow. It's the best picture on the internet.com. Very artistic, meticulously executed.
So wrong.
I actually made my really good friend a mouse pad with that and put it on my checkbooks too, just so that people look at it and go, what? Because I think it's funny. So we know what that means, right? Is this art? No, but everybody in the world will understand what that means, right? Even from the time you're like 5 years old. Even if it's like that, you understand what it means still, right? So design is less like the Mona Lisa and the very best picture on the internet, and more like a sign, right? Think design, sign, right? You're supposed to be giving people signs and clues as to how to use your website, okay? That said, color and kind of some artistic concepts are important because they change what your site says about you. Sorry, I must have missed a slide there. So this stop sign or this stop sign, it looks like a really simple thing, right? Looks like anybody could draw it, right? Could everybody easily come up with a concept? Probably not so much, right? It isn't simple. It's not something that, you can't just hand a designer a project and expect them to crank it out really quickly because, it's so easy. Just look at it. No, it takes some time to think about how to communicate that. But it's not easy to create, but it should look simple in the end. Design is communication, and ideally with it being a visual thing on a website where people probably, or on a website or even in an interface, more likely in this case, the point is to communicate as quickly as possible what the user needs to do there, who you are, what they need to do when they get to your site. What does your design say about you? I don't know what projects you're on. Obviously, about half the room is probably on Bluehost, so they have designers that work with their place. A lot of the people on small projects don't have designers, So how can you fix it? We have, with permission, I asked Clint Savage, who is running the Goose Linux project, if I could kind of help him with the design of the site. And he's like, go for it, please. That would be awesome. So we're going to use this kind of as a, I figured I could talk about design concepts and go really high level, but without actually seeing it, it's not going to really sink in. So we're going to use this as an example. This is our before shot. If you go to gooseproject.org, that's what they've got right now. So a couple of, and again, my goal here isn't to say, how to become a designer, because that takes a lot of years of experience and practice and reading and everything else, but just how to do some really simple things that will help out a lot, because that needs some help, right? So thing number one is color. I would generally advise, unless you understand color theory and kind of know what's going on, keep your color schemes really, really simple, just so that you don't end up with, that. There are a couple options you can do. You can do everything in black and white. Actually, usually when I start a design process, I start out in black and white, because I tend to take from the content and then build up from there. So I start it in black and white so that, my thought processes aren't affected by color, and then adding color later, because color has meaning. In this case, you guys aren't even necessarily going to worry about the meaning of color, but do worry about, the harmony and how it looks. So black and white is one option. Doesn't necessarily look good here. You can go monochromatic, where pretty much everything is in the same tones. It's okay. For this one, I would recommend going mostly neutral, but sticking with one color, maybe one more color, So they have, Clint said that he wanted to use this blue color. So I'm just changing one little thing at a time on this site, by the way, just like one little edit, and we'll go through. But right here, he said he really liked the blue, so I'll keep the blue for the site and change everything else kind of to black and white and shades of gray, because that's one easy way to simplify the color scheme. Contrast. You guys may not have heard the little ditty about accentuating the positive. Contrast is about accentuating the differences. We have right here the status up there. Can you guys read that very well? You can't, right? The biggest problem here is that there's not enough difference between the darker color. And I just went, he had that red in the background, to the gray version of that red. There's not enough contrast right there. And so we want to pump that up a little bit, give it enough brightness that you can actually see it, right? That's one little thing that you can do. Just make sure that there's enough contrast between your fonts and things like that. One thing about contrast, we think of contrast as in differences of colors, but contrast is really just a difference in anything, right? And so anything that is outside of a norm or a certain standard is going to stand out. You'll run into that, like on this page, you can see where some things line up and some things move over, like anything that's different from the alignment, anything that's different from the colors or different sizes, anything that is different is going to stand out or stand back, depending. And so you'll just kind of want to pay attention to that as you're designing things. We won't go into that too much more. So this is what we've got so far. Still needs some help, but it's a little better than the red, right? Okay. Another thing to pay attention to is the length of your lines of text. Does anyone here speed read? Has anyone studied that a little bit? I studied it. I'm not really great at speed reading, but one thing that you want to do is try to be able to see all of the line, so that your eyes aren't tracking clear across the page. In this case, your eyes are going to track all the way across the page and go down to the next line, and then all the way across again. And so you want to actually bring in your text columns a little bit. They say that the best readability is optimum 60 EM. That's like your character widths, or the length of an EM line. I say that depends on the kind of page that you're running. In this case, 60 EM was still a little too wide because the sentences were short. The idea is that you don't want to have to track all the way across and all the way across again. If it's too narrow, then your eyes are just unless you're a speed reader, then your eyes are just going back and forth too much. So you want to just be able to just make it so it's a comfortable width for reading, you know? And look at it in different resolutions and things like that. I tend to base my designs on EMs if I can, at least with min and max widths and EMs so that, you know, it will work in different resolutions. Yes? There's an M dash that, like if you were writing something and you have this kind of longer dash, that's an M. So I say EMs because I learned all this by reading online, and I always said EMs. So
did you say 6 EMs?
about 60.
60. Oh.
Yeah, about 60 character widths across, including spaces. Yeah.
The EM is a general term for typesetting, and if you look it up on Wikipedia, you can learn a little bit about it. It'll probably help you out.
Yeah, but it's also a measurement in your CSS. So you can say, you know, define in pixel widths. You can design in percentages, but I design in those when I can. Yeah?
So backtracking a little bit to the contrast, you
Mhm.
said something like that gray is the same as the red, but it's gray. It's the same
Yeah.
What does
What does that
that
mean? Okay. Well, if you were to take the color that he had there, it has a few values. You know, you have your red, green, and blue, but you also have your hue, which is like the tint, your saturation, which is how much tint is in there, and your brightness. And so this is the same brightness. So because I completely desaturated it, so it took out the hue because there's no hue left, and there's no saturation left. There's only brightness left there. And so that's the same brightness as his red that he had, roughly the same. So
grays just have brightness.
yeah, grays have brightness. So, and I would still, in fact, I think toward the end I decided to bump up that GL status color just a little bit more because it's still a little bit too dark for my taste. But I was just grabbing that based on this color that he was using here. So anyway, that's that. And do seriously keep asking questions. And sorry, I didn't mean to like mangle the mic. Do keep asking questions though as we go because I don't want to be one of those people that talks in a foreign language, you know? Well, that didn't make sense, but whatever. I always say, like, words aren't my native language because I like visual stuff. Anyway, so alignment. I talked a little bit before about how stuff that is out of line is going to stand out. Was anyone here ever in marching band? Not a single person? Oh, no.
We're all nerds.
You're all nerds and nobody was in marching band. For real? Okay. Well, in marching band, imagine you've got this block of people marching along, and someone is stepped out of line. Are they going to stick out like a sore thumb? They are, right? So you want to pay attention to how stuff is aligned in the web page. You can break stuff out of alignment if you want to emphasize it. But in this case, you've got so many things. I drew little lines next to all of the kind of starts and stops of where things are lined up. If you want to emphasize something, maybe emphasize one or two things. Don't make everything on the page kind of all over the place. So just fixing alignment will go a long way to making a difference on the page. So in web design, it's kind of somewhat more difficult to fix the bottom alignment. Depending on how you set things up, right alignment is easy, but it's harder sometimes to align it on both sides. So I would pay attention at least to the top and to the left and make sure that those kind of match up so that, you know, you aren't having things all over the page, because where are your eyes supposed to go, you know, on that? All right.
I have a question for you.
Yes.
I'm already seeing kind of a break between the programmer and the designer, and that is that you've already started to go down the road of fixed. You've kind of blended. You've got variable width on the header, but fixed width on the content section. And I think you've done that because you want to have control over your column widths, et cetera, et cetera. That's one of the problems that we're constantly having is, you know, the designer wants to fix with everything because he wants ultimate control and ultimate power, and the programmers want it to be variable width because that's the way the browsers and the web is supposed to be and the way it's made, et cetera, et cetera. Would you then also suggest in your fixed width sections that you actually define the character widths in rather than letting the user have control over the size, et cetera, et cetera? I mean, can you talk to that a little bit more, please?
Yes, I can. And really quickly, just one quick comment, because this is a misconception. Designers don't like to design in fixed widths so that they have ultimate control. I'm just saying.
Maybe that's projecting our design.
Yeah, it is a misconception, though, that, I mean, sometimes there's like this rift between designers and programmers, and it doesn't have to be that way. This isn't necessarily, well, we'll let you address that.
I think
Sorry, I keep hitting
one of
that.
the benefits to doing it the way that you've specified is using the EM allows the concept of fixed width to also allow the person or browser viewing the page to change the font size. And when you change the font size, the EM adjusts to the font size change because EM is based on
It's based on the width of a font.
the font itself, not on a number of pixels. That gives you greater flexibility. The thing that the designers are trying to get is this length that's appropriate for the human eye, and the thing that the developers want is the ability to put whatever can possibly be shoved in there because you know someone's going to ask for it.
Mm-hmm.
And EM is a great way to fit both of those criteria.
Yeah, that's why I recommend that. I didn't actually move the header over yet because I was focusing on the body text here. But in alignment, I would actually assign the same width to the header and scooch it on over there so that it's lined up. Just so that...
With that ultimate control again.
It's because I want to control your life. It's because I don't have enough control at home. Right? No, it's not about that.
And also, then when you start with your headers and your, do you try and keep your headers complete text so that when they do change the size of that font, that your header expands and contracts with your content, or do you get into mixed graphics and then does it screw everything up, or?
That is a curious question. Well, what I try to do, actually right now, most of the browsers will resize the graphics with you, and so that's not a problem. But back in the day, before browsers resized graphics, I mean, I'm like a total standardista, and that was actually one slide that I have toward the back that I meant to move toward the front, so I'll address that in a second. But I'm really into web standards and making sure that it's going to display in every condition, and for people who can't even see it all, you know, for them to be able to read it. That's why that accessibility class that you guys said nobody was going to, that's cool stuff. You should have gone there. But that is extremely important to me. And so even before images would resize in most browsers, I would use my CSS to display images where I needed them. Like, I think it's appropriate to display a logo. I really do. I think that there are cases where an image is a good choice. I generally do not use images as text because I think that's, you know, from the programming standpoint, it's horrible, and from the designer standpoint, you're like, from the SEO standpoint, it's terrible, terrible, and, you know, need to change one little word. Oh, well, let's pull out Photoshop again, you know. You don't want to do that. So use images where images are appropriate. Really quick on the semantic web and stuff like that, I kind of added that as an afterthought and saying, you know, this talk didn't cover these two topics, but they're actually fairly foundational. Number one, to be sure that everything works on the site. You know, you don't, I mean, that's not really a visual thing, but in this case, I don't know if you guys want to pull up the site on your computer, but where would you click first on that site if you wanted to go back?
What's the URL again?
It's, I think it's gooseproject.org.
If you wanted to go back to the home page, you mean?
Yeah, well, if you wanted to go back to home, you'd probably click home. But I think that a lot of users would click on the biggest thing on the page, right? You would assume that this GL 6.0 status is a logo. It's not. But that's kind of a convention that people are used to, that the big thing in the upper left is going to be a logo, right? You see that on websites everywhere. It's kind of what people do. It's a convention. I think that it's wise to follow conventions, unless you know exactly why you're breaking them. So, but in this case, if you click on the GL 6.0 status, what does it bring you to? Anybody?
A blank page says this page is currently blank.
Yeah. You don't want that. Sometimes people will think that a cool thing in design is to go ahead and have all the links at the top. Don't put them there if they don't link to anything. It's just going to frustrate your user. Those links are there because they're supposed to tell your design or tell your user what to do. And if you're telling them, "Oh, click here," and they click here and there's nothing there, they're just going to get mad and be like, "Ah, screw this," and get off the site. So you don't want to do that to people. Anyway, and then following web standards, where if it's a title, mark it up in your title tags. Not with title tags, but with your heading tags. Do the appropriate things like that, so that if you do run into a case where it's going to display completely as text, it's going to work that way. Also, that works better for editing with your CSS, which is how I do it. I don't know if every designer jumps in and takes the code from bare bones and just starts styling it up. That's what I do. That's what I prefer to do, and I think you end up with a better user experience that way. So I'm going to show you more properly aligned. You guys see the difference there? I don't necessarily agree with the way the status bar is there, but just kind of aligning it in a way that is more, number one, standardized. Like typically these links that are kind of little functional things you'll expect in the upper right, you'll typically want the logo in the upper left, and just kind of lining it up so it looks like that. Yeah?
Looking into the future, all of our pages look like this now.
Mine doesn't. Mine don't, but
Well, they look like, what I'm referring to is the fact that now we've gone to wide screens, and we're getting to bigger screens, and luckily the screen resolution hasn't increased all that much, but it's going to coming down the pipe, I'm sure. And now we're taking the same amount of information and just stuffing it down the center of the screen, which I agree with. It's what's right now. But looking into the future as resolutions increase and screen sizes increase, I'm sure we're not going to continue to do this despite the fact that the screen is getting this big. What do you think we're going to do in the future? Are we going to go to 3 columns, or are we going to start sticking more navigation over here and advertising over here and stuff on the top? And do you think we will stick with this content box that is 2 columns of appropriate width data, or what are you planning on doing in the future?
Well, what some people are already doing, and in fact, what I don't know if you guys are familiar with Jeffrey Zeldman. Does anybody know who he is? You know who he is? Yay! He's awesome. I don't know why you don't know who he is, because he's like pretty much the godfather of web design, right? He wrote Designing with Web Standards more than 10 years ago. And his site currently, it's really funny because when I browse the web on my big fat iMac that I have at home, because doing design work you kind of need a big fat screen like that. When I browse the web, I'm always Control++. I keep it at least up 2 font sizes so that the font sizes are big enough that I'm not sitting here staring at the screen like this, trying to read all these dinky little fonts all over the place. Zeldman's page, if you visit it, and I would, but I don't quite know how to navigate on this computer without not being able to see the screen. We'll go there in a second, maybe. But his webpage, he actually has increased his font size. It was kind of funny. My comment to him, the first time I visited, was like, "Oh, I had to press Control-0 to view your page in the font size that I like," And I haven't looked at the guts of it yet. I'm pretty sure that if you're viewing it on a smaller width with a smaller resolution, that it's not like ginormous text. He's pretty sensitive to having a good user experience.
So your answer would be, if you want a bigger screen, it's probably because you want to see things bigger and allow people to see how they want to. Make it bigger, make it smaller, but still control kind of the way the content lays within the body.
Yes.
Is that correct?
We'll have a comment here.
I think that you're both saying the same thing, in that the fundamental principle is that the human eye can only read for so long before it gets bored.
Right.
And so you want to limit the amount of characters on a line. And if that means increasing the font size so that you get easier readability, go ahead and do it. And if you need to expand your design in one way or another, it also depends a lot on what you're planning on putting on the page.
Exactly.
This page is really
Simple.
text heavy, and there are no images as far as I can see. So you need to be able to break that up so that people can view it the way that they prefer to.
Right. This one's actually, give me just 1 second. This one's actually based on a pretty common layout that he just went and grabbed somewhere, an open source layout that someone's done. And so I don't think that this is the de facto standard. This is just what I would do to this design to make it better. But for me personally, as a designer, if I'm going to lay out a page, I seriously take into consideration everything that needs to go on the page and then arrange it according to priority to say, what do people need to know and do first? And then set it up that way. I'm not one who wants to fill the entire screen with columns, though, because I don't think that that's going to help people. You had a comment, sorry.
I was just similar to what has already been said, but if the elements on the page increase proportionally, then it doesn't matter. That's what you want. If you're going to increase the size, that's essentially what you're doing when you're like hitting.
Yeah, that's what I'm doing when I'm Control++ to make it a little bigger. Do you guys ever do that? Who has big, huge screens at home? Is that just something for, I'm not really that old, but I feel old. Is that something the old people do? Or?
No, I don't think the old people know that they can do that.
That's the truth.
That is the problem.
It is the truth. I have to go help my dad out with that all the time.
I just got a new laptop, and this tiny little screen is 1080p, and it's terrible. I constantly have to Control++ on websites that I would never have had to do that on a screen where the DPI was reasonable.
Reasonable.
And
Well, and 1080p is awesome for some things, but,
for some things, maybe, yeah. For watching a movie, sure, but for surfing the web, it's not.
it's a little rough.
Well, and then there's some of us that complain that all the screens have gone to 1080p because we want a higher vertical resolution on our screen, and the screen manufacturers have stopped doing that.
Yeah, and there's a bunch of different things.
So with screen resolution and size, I think there are a couple of considerations. One is that a lot of people are using laptops, and they just aren't going to get bigger. They may get more resolution, but it'll be like the Retina display on the iPad, where it'll just be more pixels in the same amount of space. I think where you see the screen usage, as a developer, I want 2 or 3 screens on my desktop where I do development, but it's not to look at a web page bigger. It's because I want to have 3 web pages up and a code.
And be able to turn and look at the one you want, yeah.
And some reference and stuff like that. So in those cases, I'm going to just have multiple windows spread out around. So the windows are going to be smaller. I'm going to make use of it. But I don't think that, and as an old person, and my eyes are going.
My eyes were going when I was 9, so, I mean, I'm just saying. Yeah, well, and that's, again, going back to the using EMs, or, like I say, people used to say use widths for design, but that doesn't work when your screens are like this wide, If you use EMs for determining your widths and things like that, it's pretty much always going to be in a fairly readable format. When it comes to, designing something responsive, you might set some mins and maxes so that, so that it won't force scroll or do silly things like that on the screen, But if you keep it at that, then if someone does Control++ in the first place, or if this computer with a super high resolution comes with a default set for a readable font, I would hope that they would do that. I don't have anything 1080p, so I don't know. But it would go by the default font size and kind of build off of that. So does that help? Yes?
The other thing that I would say is, if you haven't already read up on it yet or not, because it would answer some of the questions that you're saying, is if you start looking into responsive or adaptive design, there's like tons of books on that, or tons of resources online that talk about that stuff. That will solve a lot of the problems that you're referring to.
It will.
You just have to do it smart, because there's a lot of people that will use the media queries because that's like the responsible way to do it, but when you increase the size of your browser, it just makes it look worse. But if you do it in a smart way, then...
Well, and there's a lot, I mean, you could That's one of the things where design is definitely not easy when it comes to the responsive stuff, because you really have to think a lot about how you want to do it. Back to the pixel control person, I am not that person. The web was not designed for pixel control. It's not going to work that way because we have so many different resolutions. I think if you start with designing with standards in the first place, most of my sites that I used those techniques on, when it went to phones, it was like, oh, looks fine. You know, I actually had the same site or the same design on my website for like since 2003 for a very long time, and you couldn't tell. It looked fine. I've recently started to tweak with the design, and I'm not liking it. I might actually switch back to my 2003 design because it works. It works fine, but it's because I started with standards in the first place. So, and it's not undesigned, you know, like this. It looks designed, and people say, oh, that's a nice website. Yeah, I should probably update it, but, you know, anyway. Anyway, that's just a reminder. Our after, this is our before, that's our after. Again, it's, you know, what does the design say about you? I might not agree with his layout and things like that, but just some very, very simple changes can make a huge difference. I think, do you guys think it makes a huge difference? I do.
Color, contrast, and alignment.
Yep, I've got your check. Use a simple color scheme. I mean, there are some sites that are designed by designers that have a lot of colors and they look awesome. That's cool if you know what you're doing with color. If you don't, keep it simple. Use a very simple color scheme. I usually would say black and white plus, or black, white, and shades of gray plus like your color from your logo or something like that, just to keep it.
If they already have a scheme of some sort, should you, I mean, can you not just, I mean.
Yeah, if they already have a scheme, that means you have a designer.
The wrong colors for the wrong place, but for the most part,
Yeah.
you'd be okay.
But if you have a scheme, you probably have a designer, right?
Yes.
Okay, so if you have a designer, it's probably.
We do a lot of programming before the designer comes in. And then
That's true.
We only have one designer and a lot of programmers, so
Okay.
the designer has to come around usually after the fact and put his
And
2
fix
cents
it.
in.
Yeah, I hear you.
So
That
a lot of
happens
things
too.
you never even touch.
Well, in that case, if you have a designer that comes in afterward, I would just stick with, I mean, I wouldn't even worry about color. If you have a designer, they'll deal with that. They'll know what to do. But if you don't have a designer, as many of these projects do not, you're going to have some color in there to make it convey your message. And that's the cases where I would say, you know, remember your contrast. Remember your, just stick with a very simple color scheme so that it's really, really straightforward and easy for you, and then there's not going to have as much random meaning tied into the colors that you might not be privy to. So, yeah, so fix your contrast issues, both in color and, you know, in font sizes and stuff like that. If everything's all the same font, how are people going to know where to look first? You know, so make some of your, I mean, that's, if you're using semantic markup, it's going to automatically do some of that anyway. But anyway, mind your line length and check your alignment. Those are the really simple things. This is the stuff that we didn't cover. Like I said, conventions are your friends, so use semantic markup. It makes such a difference. And then, like I said, follow the rules unless you understand why you're breaking them. So again, with just the typical stuff that you see on the websites right now, you have the logo on the left, you have some kind of functional keys up the top, you have the footer at the bottom, you have your content in the middle. Just roll with it. You'll be fine. That's with a website. If it's an application, kind of look and see what are the standards in the applications. You know, I think maybe having the bar along the top, you know, with the menu so that you can use those kind of things. Stuff like that. The other thing, I run into this comment a lot when I'm dealing with programmers. You know, I say, well, I don't know if the users would really see it that way. Well, that's how I would see it. You know, this is how I think. This is how it is when I'm looking at my 3 screens at home and thinking with my programmer mind. Unless your audience is programmers, it's not going to work for you, right? And even if your intended audience is only programmers, you're probably going to have some people who don't think the same way you do. And so try to really just step through the experience with fresh eyes. And if you can't do that, just grab someone who is not you. You know, in my case, I don't have a lot of people to grab, but I have my kids, you know, so I'll say, hey, what do you think of this? What would you click on first? What, where would you go if you wanted to do da-da-da-da-da-da? There are some great books on user interface testing. It's not rocket surgery. I can't, it's slipping my mind. But, no, he says it's not rocket surgery in the title. I can't remember. Krug, I can't remember what it's called, though. Do you want to Google that for me? Anybody? But it's on usability testing and how it's really not as crazy, scientific, and weird as you might think.
Web usability is not rocket surgery.
It's not rocket surgery. There you go. Stephen Krug, right? Yeah, or Krug. Again, it's one of those things where I only read it, so I don't know how it's actually pronounced. Don't Make Me Think. He has a couple of them. Yeah.
Don't make me think.
Yeah. Well, that's what he's a specialist in that. He's really cool. So, and then the last thing on the list. Just be good to the designers, because, what we're doing, programming isn't easy, right? But neither is design. And I think a lot of times, there's this conflict. The whole, you're just doing this because your mom didn't hug you enough or whatever, It's not that. There are reasons that we're doing this, and I think if we can be respectful of each other, and then you're more likely to get and keep designers on your projects in the first place. So, yes?
I think you're also much more likely to get a designer to bend to your will if you have a reason that's legitimate for presenting that. If you
right.
say, I can't read this very well on my screen because there's so much of this or that, the designer's much more likely to respond to that than just having a comment of, I don't like it, you should do it my way.
Right. And so it's just like, who gets bug reports from people or, stuff like that. You get the notes from them. If they just send your report, it doesn't work. Okay. Well, it's the same way with design. I don't like it. Okay. And usually a lot of times in those cases, if someone reports something, they'll just, shoot back, okay, well, go ahead and submit a patch. And you're like, if you're a designer, you're like, I have no idea how to submit a patch. I guess I'm kind of stuck, Well, you could kind of turn that around a little bit and say, if the programmers are complaining to designers and saying, do this, open up your paint program and just kind of draw it out so that they can see what you're talking about. That goes a long way towards actually communicating when it's a visual thing. And yeah, it's going to look kind of sucky in paint and might humble you a little bit. That's okay. I'm not against programmers, like I say, because I'm like totally bridging the gap here. But I've just been on both sides of the aisle, so I can understand. So anyway, I forgot I put that in there. This was just my little notes. Obviously, I didn't design this talk very much, speaking of designs and layouts and stuff like that. I wasn't going to wow you with that this time.
You know your audience.
Pardon?
You know your audience.
I know my audience, exactly. Yeah, so now we have Q&A. This is me. This is my website that I recently tried on a new thing. It still looks very much like my old website, but it's been, Ryan can vouch for it, right? It's been like pretty much the same forever and ever. But that's my Twitter username if you want to find me there. And I'm just Velda. Velda Christensen, Velda Harper Christensen, Velda Harper, depending on whether you knew me a long time ago or not. But anyway, so that's that. And we had a lot of questions, but we can check different websites now if you want, or if you want to have, yeah.
I have a question. This gentleman over here brought up a really good point. We've talked a little bit about the fluidity of designs, which is really important because it allows your users to view it the way that they want to, and the font size is comfortable for them. But one of the biggest challenges that I see is when someone along the line mandates that we have to have a specific image in a page that is rasterized and fixed with, and trying to expand it or shrink it makes it look terrible. So the designer wants to make the image look good, and the developer doesn't want to make a fixed width.
Yeah.
And I think that generates a lot
of conflict there.
A lot of conflict. So what are your suggestions for situations like that?
For dealing with that, if it's, excuse me, my checks are not settling with me well because of my nervous stomach, but one thing that I do, depending on the situation, number one, I try not to incorporate images into the layout. If I can avoid it, I mean, there are certain places where a little image might be cool, but like a huge image in the layout, to me, isn't necessarily the smartest thing. Like, and when I say the layout, I mean the overall site layout. There are content images. Like if I'm going to have an image in my article, obviously, you want to have the image there. And I don't think that that one is, I mean, it will matter as far as the width. Like you might make it half the width or full width of your text or whatever and let it float around or let it be a little thing like this. But I don't think that's as big a deal as when an image is actually used in the layout. Also, one thing, I have noticed that most browsers are handling image resize a lot better. So I will oftentimes just make the image a certain width and then change it by %. And so you change the width to whatever percentage, and then you change the height to auto, and it really doesn't look too bad in most modern browsers. Ancient browsers, you would have had like a pixelized, weird-looking mess. That's not so much anymore. So that's not as big a deal. Sometimes you will have an image that is part of the layout, and in some cases it makes perfect sense. You know, not talking about the logo, by the way. Logos are a different beast, but like let's say you have some little image in the corner that is kind of like a background for the page. Like this was a popular thing a little while ago, have some weird, random, swirly, paisley stuff going on like that, right? You all have seen that, okay? So if you have that, you don't necessarily need to resize all of that image if you can get it so that all of the sides will fade out. That was a poor demonstration of fading out, but I hope you get what I'm talking about there. Like just kind of fade the stuff into the background, and then you can position that, and then the width of the page can still change, but that will always be there. And then as far as having your text wrap around that, if you want to go that detailed, you can do that by having some fixed width invisible boxes. I don't really recommend this technique unless you have to, but if you have to, you know, it's an option. You just put some boxes and then float your text around it, and it'll work. So I've done that before. They call it sandbagging. You can do that. It makes your markup look like crap, but that's okay. It will let you wrap around an image. Really? And not even, because you can have it wrap like a block around the image like this. I haven't kept super caught up because I'm actually studying drafting, but you could always do this. I haven't seen where you're able to wrap around some kind of, you can? If you can find it, that would be super duper rad.
I think that's possible if you use display inline or inline block on the image. It'll retain the block properties but allow text to float around it as if it's just part of it.
Yeah, but that's if you have a block-shaped image. If you have a background image that isn't shaped like a block, if it's shaped like some kind of nebulous paisley thing, since those are, that was one other thing I was going to say. Sorry if that looked a little like rough, but that's one thing. Like people are like, oh, you need to add some decoration to the page. I'm like, what does decoration tell your user? Look here. Oh, I looked there. Great. Now what? You know, I'm not into decoration just for the sake of decoration. There are some points you can use to draw attention to specific areas, and I think that's cool. But anyway, so yeah, that's that. Yes?
I wanted to share one idea. I'm one of the world's worst designers, and one of the pieces of advice text that I got was how to identify something I put together looked awful, and the CRAP model.
The CRAP model? Do tell.
So I always get these wrong. I usually have to look it up. But contrast that we mentioned, the A is alignment,
I've never heard of this.
and repetition, and proximity. The Mac store site, store.mac.com, is a good example that they use of this. So contrast and alignment, you mentioned. Repetition is the site, the web page is consistent, that they're using the same color scheme throughout. If you're having something different, then you have contrast in your
Or the same button styles.
same button styles, the curves on the boxes that people don't they may not say this box has a different curve and this box has a straight corner, but they will visually clue in on that. If things are 1 pixel off on the alignment, if you take the Mac site and you just shift the box off to insert,
Depending on whether you're 1080p or not, right?
that people wouldn't be able to say that's one off, but they would be able to say it doesn't look right.
Right.
And then proximity is putting things that go together with each other. So the different areas of quick links, purchase.
Sticking them together so you're not looking all over the place for them.
Right. Yeah. If you don't have buy this now on the left side, the bottom, the top, that's just going to look distracting.
All over the place, yeah.
So that's some simple guidelines when I know that something's not looking right to go down the
Check that list. That's a good idea. I've never heard that. I've never heard of that before.
Other people have said, so you can, a couple of people you can Google on it. Some people do the CARP.
CARP? Like carp?
Yeah,
Okay.
but
Just so it's less offensive?
It stuck with me when some designers came up and said, your website looks like crap.
Your website looks like crap. That's a good.
That was a compliment, actually.
Yeah, that's cool. Yeah.
The article I was reading is on Smashing Magazine.
Cool.
December 15th, 11th. It's called 6 CSS layout features to look forward to.
Oh, okay.
So if you want to
Awesome. So these aren't current, but they probably will be implemented with good browsers.
December 15th, 2011, so I'm sure you're...
Except for IE. I always look for things like, is it going to degrade okay in IE? If it doesn't degrade okay in IE, like if you end up with text that's all over this image that is going to make it totally unreadable, then I wouldn't do it anyway until it worked. But, it depends. Yeah.
A lot of us started making websites back in the day where the only thing was laptops, desktops. And now, there's a lot of focus on mobile, where you have an aspect ratio that's basically inverted from desktops. You got something that's taller than it is wide. What would you say would be best practices to make a website that's going to work really well in both mobile and desktop? You just do the media types, or are there some general sort of rules to follow that will work in both formats?
Work in both formats. Well, one thing you can do if you don't want to have to go through and think everything completely is just use like a design framework, because those are thought through all the time. Another thing you could do, what I typically do, is if the media width is less than so many pixels, like if it's less than 480 pixels, I'm not going to really pay attention to font size anymore, because people are going to resize their screen depending on what they need. On my phone, again, because I'm like practically blind or something without my contacts. But on my phone, I make the fonts really big, and so it's just a few things per screen. But with the speed reading, I can just kind of go right through, and I'm fine. So I just set it to a percentage so that it's taking up most of the space. But there are so many different ways you can do that. So I recommend going and checking out what people are doing with the responsive and adaptive design, and really thinking it over and thinking, okay, in different situations. Like I wouldn't go with anything that sets a certain pixel width. I would say like if it's a minimum width, then do this %, because there are going to be so many different pixel widths of screens. You're just going to make yourself absolutely insane if you try to do all of them. So I would just set a few that, okay, in this case, obviously someone's not going to want columns over here or whatever, and just make it so that your main content is the first stuff you see. So.
You mentioned the inline framework.
Yeah, there's like, I'm trying to think of a few that I looked at. There are several built on the golden rectangle and on, that's what I would typically look at when I'm designing a site if I'm looking for appropriate proportions and stuff like that. I'm trying to think, I should Google it on here if y'all don't mind. But I have to figure out how to switch the screen back. Was it F3? Thanks. By the way, this guy saved the day because my little netbook was not very happy with the VGA. So tell me your name.
Shane.
Shane, thank you. Super appreciate it. Yeah, we can take off the. I could just Google. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Well, we can do. So you can't see the mouse on the screen here. So can you guys see it there?
Oh, where did it go?
I don't know. What if we do this? If we want to just do the, is it Alt D for the address or Command D? No, that's a bookmark. I'm so glad you've got that. Apple L.
That's right.
Apple L.
There's the address there.
Oh. Okay, so if we look for,
So that's Chrome. You can do a search.
Can't see what I'm doing. Yeah, I probably typed it wrong, but if you just Google like adaptive design frameworks and stuff, there are like less framework. There we go. That one's a pretty good one here. If you look at this. This has columns that it's built on. That's where you come into your super picky control freak designer. This will make them happy. I love columns. If I'm going to do anything in print, I'm doing columns. Period. If I'm going to do it on the web, I don't think that columns are always the best thing in the world, even on the big screen. But
it seems like the print world just lost out. Finally, I mean, widescreen is for movies. It is not for print. It never has been, never will be. This is for print. You guys the print people are going to win out on mobile devices, and the movie people are going to win out on widescreen normal devices. There's got to be some way in the end. I don't know. Are we going to go to a 3-column format, the old standard thirds, or
like I say, it just depends on your site.
When your screen size gets bigger, you don't full screen your browser anymore. I haven't full screened my browser since 1024, I don't think.
Yeah.
Well, but you still have a tendency with a square screen. For example, SEO. Google comes out and says, "Hey, below the fold, not as useful. We're not going to give you as much credibility." Well, guess what? That means you've got to smash more stuff up above the fold, and the fold just got a lot.
Well, how do they determine the fold, though? What's their algorithm for actually determining where the fold is on the page?
That's a good question.
I would think
I can guarantee it's going to be based on this, not on
tools.
Where exactly it's going to lay out, but the fold is going to depend. I don't know their algorithm. It's going to depend on the screen size and stuff like that. That could be. I think that generally, if you're writing your content, or not your content, if you're laying out your HTML properly, then your stuff that's important is going to be toward the top anyway.
SEO people shouldn't ruin the experience just to get it ranked well.
Yeah.
There are things that you can do. You can
Yay!
add more pages. You can, I don't know. You don't have to stuff everything up above the fold like that.
It is true, but
Yeah, because you don't want people to end up on the page and then be like, well, "This sucks."
But the
Out,
devil's advocate says that, hey, guess what? You have a very fantastic page. No one's going to see it. Enjoy it by yourself. So you do have to work in the SEO elements at some point. And so I think that we're going to have to adapt to some way that 2 style sheets, one for the desktop, the other for the mobile, because the mobile is still built for a single column or a 2-column layout.
It just depends.
This
totally depends on your site. You had a comment.
I was just going to say, if you're trying to make sure that your site is optimized for SEO and you want to get the right content above the fold, don't try and cram too much in there. You know, make the most important stuff, the stuff that's up above the fold and with great white space and everything, so that people can use it. And then if you have to add other content, put it down below the fold, or on other pages or something.
Remember that humans are inside. I mean, another thing like with SEO, I mean, there's other things that you can do where things can actually like exist like farther down on the page, but in the code you put it up higher. I mean, that's what Google
You can do that.
So you can like
but if you think
things in the code how in whatever order you want them to be in, but the way that it actually looks on the page is
we're
totally
done.
different.
Completely done? 1 minute? Okay. Just one really quick to kind of address that. I think that having so much stuff on your page isn't going to really help your SEO anyway, because it's about the focus of the page. Better focus is going to get you better ranks. And also having the stuff that your user is looking for clear down on the page. Even if they land on the page, they aren't going to see what they're looking for. So I think if you focus on the user experience, SEO is going to come along. And you know, obviously have, with accessibility and stuff like that too. If you do that, it'll work. So, the end, because we're out of time. Thank you guys for all your comments and questions. Thank you. I appreciate all the comments and questions, even the devil's advocate one. So, yeah, you're good at that.